Okay, hello everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on today's webinar. I hope that everybody can hear me well. My name is Jamie Boyd. I am the Director of Open Government within the Government of Canada. It's an absolute pleasure to be here sharing the next hour or so with points of contact for the Open Government Partnership from around the world, members of civil society. We're absolutely delighted that you've made the time to talk about the summit and having a very action-oriented summit to the extent possible. We have a few things that we'd like to do today. The bulk of the webinar will be spent going through our call to action that we are doing together with our civil society co-chair at the Open Government Partnership, Nathaniel Heller. So we'll go through all the different categories of the action. We would also be very happy to respond to any questions or concerns that you might have regarding your participation in the summit. Just to start with a little bit of context setting, we see open government as playing an absolutely critical role in the digital era. We know that there are threats to our democracies, disinformation, fake news. We also know that levels of citizen trust in government institutions is lower than it has been in many years around the world. We are very keen to leverage the opportunity of open government to deepen our democracy for the digital era. We see an unprecedented opportunity to deepen transparency, accountability, citizen participation, and we're hoping that we can work with you to do this on a global level. So a few objectives for today. We are hoping to present to you a call to action. This is a call to action that echoes a formal ministerial level call to action that we expect will be issued to all OGP ministers on behalf of Canada's lead minister for open government, Minister Murray, the president for the Treasury Board and Digital Government, as well as for the OGP Civil Society co-chair, Nathaniel Heller. So the content that you are about to hear about today is content that echoes that formal call to action at the ministerial level. So the things that we would like to do today is, one, present this call to action to you and encourage ambition. Two, walk you through specific examples of what interventions might look like, actions or commitments. And finally, to present to you a very clear sort of set of next steps. I'm absolutely delighted also to be joined by a number of open government leaders on this call. So here on my team in Ottawa, we've got Benoit Frenette, who is our lead for international engagement on open government, and Natalia Little. We also have a number of friends and colleagues from the Open Government Partnership. So Jaime, Allison, Tonu, thank you for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge Azuke, who is going to be joining us today, and he is a fellow member of the OGP Steering Committee. Please feel free to type in any questions or comments in the comment bubbles. We will be monitoring that together with our colleagues from the OGP, and we would be happy to respond to it. I hope you can see the presentation that is on the screen here. You'll see that we have 3 buckets of priorities for Canada and Nathaniel's leadership for the OGP for 2018-19. Those 3 major objectives are around participation, inclusion, and impact. So I'm going to very briefly walk you through what we mean by these 3 categories, and then I'll be turning it over to our experts to provide a little bit more detail about each category. The first is around participation. Essentially, we would like to leverage the Open Government Partnership in order to advance more participatory models within domestic open government efforts. We all know that we're required to have multi-stakeholder forums. The compliance rate in our countries with activating those forums, it's not so great. So we would love to have higher compliance with that. We really like to embed citizen engagement and participation in our government efforts collectively and really get this movement beyond just data. Inclusion. Feel that when we open our governments, we need to open them to those who are digitally savvy or who are hyper empowered. We need to think for traditionally marginalized people, for gender minorities. Careful thought around citizen rights in the digital era, and make sure that when we are investing in open government in a digital world, that we're doing so in a way that makes sense for citizens. In terms of what these priorities look like in practice, you can see more detail on the priorities on the OGP's website, where Canada and Nathaniel have put forward an OGP co-chair vision. This webinar will also be recorded and disseminated, so that is hopefully helpful. And you can expect to hear lots about these priorities at the OGP Summit in Ottawa at the end of May. As I mentioned, they will be formally presented at the ministerial level through a joint letter that we are expecting will go out very soon. Beyond the specific priorities that the OGP governance has collectively committed to, we are hoping that the actions that support these priorities will be customized to your domestic reality. We recognize that the 79 national members of the OGP, the 20 subnational members, are very diverse. We have different priorities when we talk about open government, and actioning these priorities may look very different in your country as opposed to my country. So we are encouraging countries to think through what these priorities might mean for you, and then to work through the principles of co-creation. Get started, I would like to turn it over to Aiden from our steering committee and Tonu from the OGP to walk us through what we mean when we talk about participation and what some examples of actions or commitments might look like. You, Aiden or Tonu.
Thank you once again to all of you for taking time out to join us. We are really excited about this opportunity that the Government of Canada has provided to the partnership as a whole to scale our ambition collectively and provide a stronger voice as a partnership and identify collective actions across these three areas. So the first one that I'll talk about very briefly is actions to ensure more meaningful participation. Again, as Jamie mentioned, multi-stakeholder forums in OGP are not a new thing to most of you on this call. As you know, most OGP countries and locals have some form of civil society and government dialogue. At the end of 2018, 63 OGP members had multi-stakeholder forums in various forms. However, as we all know in practice, they don't often match up to the kind of ambition we would like to see in the partnership as an open space for dialogue between government and civil society. So one of the first examples of an action that you could take as government and civil society together is identify ways to improve spaces for civil society and government dialogue. And strengthening your OGP multi-stakeholder forum is one of them, ensuring that it's not just a checkbox exercise where you say, yes, we have a forum, but actually look at the recent OGP participation and co-creation standards. And for that, we have a toolkit on the OGP website to show you examples in which different countries have done this. For example, as Government of Argentina, our incoming co-chair, established a multi-stakeholder forum in the run-up to their last action plan cycle. And this had 8 representatives from government and civil society, and they had clear objectives for both government and civil society throughout the action plan cycle, not just in the co-creation phase, but also implementation phase. The other thing that you could do as an example of an action is to develop mechanisms for strengthening government and civil society interactions on specific policy areas. As an example, several OGP countries have created dialogue or policy consultation mechanisms inviting civil society expertise on specific issues. One example we can share with you is that from Macedonia, who had 8 OGP commitments over 3 action plans on co-creating the strategy that would govern cooperation between civil society and government. And this is one way of really hoping that that culture of civil society and government dialogue scales across government areas, not just in 1 or 2 ministries or policies, but really across levels of government. Another one is defunding civic space. Again, unfortunately, challenges around civic space are not alien to most of us. Civicus has found that over 100 countries around the world are facing civic space challenges, and these are as severe as attacks on civil society and activists, killing of journalists, to making registration processes for civil society more onerous, that shrinks the space that they work in. So one of the actions you could take to defend civic space is, for example, comply to or go beyond international legal standards on freedoms of association, assembly, and expression, fundamental rights that all countries are meant to adhere to. So one example that we have to share is Canada included a commitment to improve their information flows for civil society on the regulation of charities in a timely manner, and to ensure that they are engaged around issues of tax and other revenue matters in a fair, open, and accessible manner, so civil society knew what they were expected to do and engage in a dialogue with them on these administrative reform areas. Another example is to increase legal and policy safeguards to protect journalists and human rights defenders. An analysis that we have done in the OGP, we've seen that we don't nearly have enough commitments to defend human rights activists and journalists. And as we know, for any open government effort to be successful, it is important for a thriving, enabling environment for civil society, journalists, and others to speak out. Examples of this, or examples of actions that you can take, are implementing strong whistleblower protection laws or frameworks that protect human rights defenders. One example from the OGP is Ireland committed to building a culture of whistleblowing and adopting legislation that would protect people from speaking out in the form of a whistleblower. So this is just one example, but we hope that you can begin a dialogue on some of these in other places that you work in. And then the third, and I'll hand over back, and I'll hand over to Aidan after this, is tackling challenges of disinformation and fake news. For any meaningful participation process, it is important that the information flows that are there are open, are factual, and allow space for everyone to participate. Don't restrict space for some. And this necessitates that online spaces remain free and without the threat of misuse. One of the actions we encourage you to take are to create or co-create commitments to set up robust frameworks that would prevent manipulation of digital government surveillance, preserving net neutrality, as well as safeguarding against internet censorship and arbitrary shutdowns. So one example from OGP is Italy adopted a commitment on spreading its Charter of Internet Rights and identified specific activities that would encourage public and officials to recognize the links between both online and offline rights related to civil liberties. Another, and this is something that we will see a lot of dialogue on at the OGP Summit, is understanding what kind of codes of conduct we should mandate social media companies to adhere to. A lot of countries have been thinking about it. Government of Canada have been thinking about it. A UK parliamentary select committee published a recent report on disinformation and fake news that called for a new ethics code to be written in with the help of experts and independent regulator being set up under that. So that's just another example, but we encourage you to explore others through your OGP processes.
I just wanted to really echo the importance of having some concrete actions to go around these three themes from the summit. But I think the one that I am most keen on promoting or putting the plug on is this defending civic space. I think this is one area which all of us in the OGP family are seeing as a major challenge. But I think it's also one where we're challenged in terms of thinking what are the concrete examples or concrete action plans that can put forward that agenda of making sure that citizens have a place to express themselves, associate, and to assemble without undue influence from governments. So perhaps one thing to think about is to try and connect this a little bit with the local arm. I'm speaking from the context of Tanzania here, where as a central government, the country has pulled out of the OGP, but we're working very hard to maintain the OGP spirit inside one of the local pioneers, and this is Kigoma Ujiji. And in our work with the people there, one of the areas we're trying to work very hard on is to continue to provide spaces for especially what we're calling the marginalized majorities. So these are young people and women especially, to express their priorities at the local government level. Now, it's challenging. There are cultural norms to try and overcome, especially with respect to women speaking up and speaking out. But we are trying to provide sort of safe spaces for them to raise their issues, which are then escalated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you all for joining us today. It's really fantastic to see the turnout on the webinar here. And I really appreciate, Aidan, the great introduction and segue from civic space into talking about broader inclusion, because these are very much linked agendas. So as we've heard, advancing inclusion is very much a priority for the co-chairs and will be a prominent topic at the summit. And within the umbrella of inclusion, we're looking closely at women's participation and gender-informed actions that can help make open government better deliver for all citizens. So why should we consider gender? Opening up government is very much an underexplored method for accelerating gender equality and closing critical gaps in information, access, and participation. And our early research from the Feminist Open Government Initiative shows that when women and girls are absent from open government, so too is the knowledge and skills that really limit the potential of open government reforms. So, while OGP has made great strides in the past years, women's participation and gender perspectives in OGP remains relatively uneven around the world. As of the end of 2018, only 54 OGP commitments specifically include provisions for women or gender, which represents less than 2% of the 3,000 commitments made by national and local governments. And where we do have gender commitments, they often suffer from below average completion rates and they lack ambition. But we know that we can do better and that we need to do better. And so in 2019, we're really calling on the partnership to be intentional, strategic, and ambitious, and how it brings women and girls into the co-creation process, as well as implementation of commitments. In advance of the summit, we've asked that your government or your organization commit to taking a concrete action to advance women's participation in co-creation and implementation, as well as consider gender-sensitive commitments. Regardless of where you are in the action plan cycle, we're confident that there is an action that you can take. So for inspiration, I know that we've shared some additional documents before that has quite a bit of information and some great examples, but I'd like to highlight a few of them here today, and happy to speak further after this call. So first, one action that you can take is to make co-creation and consultation more inclusive. What do we mean by this? Consider including diverse civil society groups, including those working on gender equality within your open government processes. That can mean proactively reaching out to government departments or ministries who are tasked with leading on women and gender issues to participate in co-creation, to reach out within the government itself or within civil society to consider, are there gender experts that you can bring to help you think through some of these really big issues and think about how they affect men, women, boys, girls, and those of other genders differently, to really make sure that we're delivering for all. So one example here that I'd love to highlight is in Argentina. So Argentina is one of the few OGP countries where there is a gender-based CSO who's been involved in the open government agenda for the past few years. So right now, an organization called FEM is currently one of 4 CSOs at the National Open Government Roundtable. And Argentina has noted that having a gender-oriented CSO, so a women's group at the table, really opened up the path for strengthening work across the government on gender and open government, and was a contributing factor to earning a star on a gender commitment in their last action plan. Second, We'd also encourage you to consider ways to mainstream inclusion throughout your action plans. This can take a lot of different forms, but specifically looking at opportunities like conducting a gender-based analysis of your action plan. So taking a look at everything from your open contracting commitment to your natural resources commitments to say what within this may affect different citizens differently, and make some strategies to mitigate that or to increase your consultation with those different groups within your work. You could also look for opportunities to consider where and how you can gender disaggregate your data. So it's really difficult to know how things affect various different groups if you aren't counting them. And so thinking about what person level data is being collected and how can you disaggregate that and really understand the different experiences of citizens. So those are two examples. Within this, we have a number of countries who've made some really exciting contributions to a gender-specific engagement. So for example, Kenya included gender within their open contracting commitment. So just for background, governments spend 1/5 of their budgets buying goods and services from the private sector, but women-owned businesses supply only 1% of this market. Kenya's latest action plan has an open contracting commitment that includes, among other things, amending procurement rules to allow 30% of public procurement opportunities to be set aside for youth, women, and persons with disabilities, as well as disadvantaged groups. So this is one opportunity of thinking about a broader OGP commitment and looking for opportunities within this. Canada, and I hope Jamie might speak on this as well, is also a great example of where a country has used a gender-based analysis using the GBA Plus tool that Canada has really championed to take a look at their action plan, both across the action plan to identify where there are some gender gaps, as well as to look at one specific commitment that helps to close those gaps. And then lastly, I'd also encourage you to consider potentially a new commitment that uses open government to address a specific gap in women and girls services or policy needs. So for this, you could also consider and leverage existing work on SDG 5 or CDOT and thinking about what's happening in country and trying to bring that into the open government community. And really using OGP as an action platform to enact reforms. So one country example, Germany used its action plan to conduct regular monitoring on the status of women and men in leadership positions in both private sector bodies and the public service. And this is really an opportunity for them to understand where and how people are recruited, retained, and advanced within both public and private sector efforts. They'll then use this data and bring it into policy, using it as the basis of a framework for implementing a national act on equal participation. And so this is a great example of very specific gender-focused commitment that could be used in an open government method to really advance gender equality within a country. So those are three very quick examples. And as I said, we've shared some additional information with a much broader sense of the different opportunities within this. But I do want to just harken back to what Jamie said at the beginning of making sure that, whatever these actions are, that they fit within your national context, that they're advancing gender from where you are, and really thinking about some opportunities to make sure that our open government platforms are truly inclusive and really deliver for all citizens. I will stop there, but happy to answer questions or speak further afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Allison. I'm sorry that you're all looking at me grimacing on the camera. We're trying to fix this. Hopefully you'll get a video back soon. I think that this is an absolute priority for a movement that is trying to build itself out, try to make itself sort of more resilient. Inclusion is very much our strength as a global partnership. So this is a priority that we would really love to see good progress on. From a national government perspective, I'll give you two examples of things that the Government of Canada has done and that we would consider flagging as actions in this category. The first is a gender review of our 4th National Action Plan on Open Government. We developed our action plan through a fairly significant, at least for us, engagement process. We talked to about 10,000 Canadians. It was all very exciting. And as we started giving shape to our potential commitments, we realized that we hadn't necessarily taken a very inclusive approach, and we hadn't thought through the inclusion implications of all the commitments. So we did do an inclusion review. You can look at the, whoops, sorry about that. You can look at the results of that review through our What We Heard report that's available on our website. We engaged 4 external experts to help us with this, and you'll see that our National Action Plan includes a reference to intersectionality and an approach that makes sense for us. A second example of an inclusion commitment that could be something that would be flagged is under our federal budget from 2018. We committed to creating a Center for Gender Diversity and Inclusion Statistics at our National Statistical Agency, allowing us to further invest in inclusion and gender disaggregated data for open data. So those were both very specific examples of things that we did within Canada to try to advance inclusion. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them out and we'll address them after we get through the third priority. Our third priority is, of course, impact. And as we've thought this through over the course of of recent months, it's become clearer and clearer to us that the impact that we really do need to be prioritizing in the digital era is impact for digital democracy. So much of the sort of impact of digital change in governments has been incredible. We have wonderful new opportunities to really put citizens at the center of our digital services. We have wonderful opportunities to become more responsible and effective in the use of emerging technology. But these kinds of opportunities won't necessarily be capitalized on if we aren't careful and consistent in our approach. So I'd now like to turn to Tonu to walk us through what we have in mind when it comes to impact for digital democracy. Over to you, Tonu.
Thanks again, Jamie. So one of the things that I think is worth noting is that there is a significant link between the 3 priorities. They are not standalone, but they're for any open government effort, the need to recognize open spaces for dialogue, both online and offline, protection of citizens' rights and civil society's rights online and offline, and ensuring that these conversations are inclusive are very much interconnected. And to that extent, really appreciate the Government of Canada's efforts in making those linkages. Pick up where Jamie left off. So therefore, the third area is actions to create impact for digital democracy, and more specifically ensure that digital spaces that are developing more and more online and can be seen as spaces where democratic dialogue and democratic processes are taking place are protected and protected against digital threats. So 3 areas that we are giving examples in, but again, to note that this is definitely an area that's developing fast, and that is an area that's developing every day, and recognizing that different countries have different contexts in which they operate. So the first example is that in this digital era, or in an evolving digital conversation, citizens' rights need to be protected equally, online as well as offline. So, one example is that there have been big debates on use of citizens and user data by governments, by social media companies, especially where they have led to infringement of privacy, harassment, and political targeting. So, for example, linking to the gender conversation, it is recognized that the likelihood of women getting targeted online is much higher than men getting targeted online. There is also conversations around development of data protection legal frameworks that take into account conditions for data processing and disclosure of personal data, including giving rights to the individual to control what is accessed, stored, and shared by businesses and public bodies. So to give you one example of what's happening in the OGP is in its OGP action plan, Australia committed to building and maintaining a public trust to address concerns about data sharing and release. including to improve privacy and personal information protections in using and sharing data. Again, going back to the point that we recognize that this is an evolving conversation, but that it needs to include civil society, citizens, and experts as this conversation evolves in some form or another. Of course, the European or GDPR is another example which sort of shows the responsibility of data holders to comply with standards, right? And this is where we've seen the European GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, go a step further. And we encourage other countries to look at it as a model where you're looking at data protection laws. The second is understanding that emerging technology will influence the way we interact, will influence the way governments function, and therefore it is important that they remain open and ethical, preventing misuse by vested interests. So one example is use of algorithms by governments, or AI. And increasingly, AI and algorithms are being used for functioning like taxation systems, operating public services, so very much connected to the intersection and interaction with citizens. So it's very important that this use of these emerging technologies are human-centric, that they're in line with international regulation, and they have proactively designed consultation mechanisms with experts and citizens. We have a first set of OGP countries making commitments in this area. And some examples of these countries are France, the Netherlands, Portugal. And to give you one concrete commitment example, France committed to improving the transparency of public algorithm and source codes, more specifically to develop a methodology in collaboration with administration for opening algorithms and codes included in their information systems. I know the Government of Canada is also working in this space, and hopefully they'll talk a little bit about that. But there are conversations around this at the summit, where we hope there could be some conversations of what kind of global norms are expected in this emerging area. The third is the importance of having oversight and redress mechanisms. So the creation of independent bodies with the necessary mandate and resources to provide proactive redress of violations. So offices of ombudsman, or like the recent UK paper on online harms has looked at the creation of an independent regulator that will have a mandate of interacting with private sector companies, citizens groups, industry bodies, civil society, and public bodies, etc. So we are seeing some of these, like I said, the UK is an example, the EU is an example, Canada is an example, and hopefully we'll see more of this develop. Just before I end, two things to note is, one, we as the OGP support unit, of course, Government of Canada and others in the steering committee are here on hand to provide any support that you might need as you think through your existing regulatory policy systems to see where you might want to improve, or any new commitments that you want to make in discussion with civil society and government in your multi-stakeholder forums. So we are here to connect you to experts, to organizations who can provide the support. We're also happy to connect you to other OGP member governments who may have done this, or civil society who may have done this, to see if you're interested in looking at comparisons or seeing experiences when it comes to implementation. The second important thing that we want to highlight is, and as Jamie said, we really see Canada's co-chair agenda and this summit being a starting point for this conversation. We hope you bring some concrete actions to the summit that we see grow over the summit and beyond. And again, we're here in hand to provide any support you need on that. Over to you, Jamie.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tonu. So just to emphasize from a national government perspective, this is a growth area for us, and we see lots of potential to see great progress on impact. So examples of the sorts of things that we would see falling into this category. You'll see on the screen that we've talked about citizen rights in the digital age. So there we're conscious that there are a number of different groups internationally that are looking to try to advance frameworks. The Contract for the Web would be an example of one such framework where we're looking at the rights and the sort of frameworks for moving forward in a responsible manner. When we talk about open and ethical use of emerging technologies, you can look to, as an example, some of the commitments in Canada's 4th National Action Plan on Open Government. You'll see that the Government of Canada committed to being an open source first government. So our code, any code that we develop should be open source unless there's a good reason. That was one of our commitments. We also committed to the responsible use of algorithms, and one of the deliverables that we've had under that commitment is the creation of the Government of Canada's Algorithmic Impact Assessment, which we developed on the open. We actually wrote most of it on GitHub, and it's an example of how we've committed to ensuring that we look at the potential impact of the use of an algorithm and are transparent about government's use of those algorithms. We're also looking at strengthening our governance, so things like the G7 rapid response mechanism would be another example of how we're sort of collaborating to try to bolster democratic processes in the digital age. So lots of really interesting and exciting examples there. So I see that we are now at just about 11:15 Eastern Time, which means that we've got only 15 minutes to wrap things up. And I know that Jaime has a lot of content to get through, so I'm going to turn to Jaime, and I'll ask you, Jaime, to try to keep things within 5 minutes so that we can then leave the last 10 minutes to respond to questions. So Jaime, let's go to the next slide and walk the points of contact and everybody else through the process. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And yes, I will do my best to keep it under 5 minutes, absolutely. Just joining my colleagues and thanking everybody for your time and for joining us. What I wanted to present was just a few key points on the next steps and the accountability that we're implementing for this mechanism. So of course, as you know, last week, the Government of Canada circulated this call to action with all the OGP points of contact as a preview for today's webinar. As Jamie has mentioned, in a few days, the OGP ministers will also receive the call to action from the co-chairs of the steering committee, the Government of Canada and Nathaniel Heller, outlining these priorities and also the suggested actions that OGP members can take in supporting these priorities. Of course, in the spirit of co-creation and in line with the OGP process and standards, all governments are being encouraged to discuss with local civil society and other members of their multi-stakeholder forum how the summit can be an action-forcing moment to increase the ambition of current OGP action plans or to commit to an ambitious commitment within these areas in your next OGP action plan. We, of course, understand that the timing for many OGP co-creation processes may not coincide with the summit, and that's perfectly fine. So we will therefore welcome actions that are either part of an action plan, ideas for the next, and also actions that may fall outside of the scope of an action plan, but that still may aim to advance these priorities, such as broadening the base of MSFs and the other ideas that have been shared by my colleagues in the prior presentations. We also understand that the majority of the actions will not be one-off activities, and to ensure that all OGP members have the support necessary to advance these key areas beyond the summit. OGP will follow up with those who have submitted the actions to also identify ways to showcase your commitments, as well as to provide you support for the implementation of these actions where useful. And within the steering committee, we will be presenting an update of these actions at the Q4 steering committee meeting taking place in November, December of this year. So between now and the summit, we will be collecting the actions from OGP members through a tracker that has been shared with all POCs last week, which looks a little bit like this. While the actions will continue to be collected on a rolling basis throughout the summit, please note that if you would like your actions to be showcased and or be considered for a speaking role, we're kindly asking POCs to submit your actions or information by May 15th. In an effort to, of course, keep these actions concrete and concise as possible, we will only be taking into consideration the actions that are submitted through these trackers. So for civil society colleagues, we highly encourage you to work with your POCs within your countries to co-create actions, to think through possible things that could be added through this tracker. And lastly, I just want to reiterate that the OGP super units will be available to discuss potential actions with you to provide the support necessary for OGP members that would desire it. So I'll just leave you with the timelines that were briefly discussed, and I'll hand over back to Jamie.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jaime. Okay, so we'll now open it up to questions. As you can see, we do have a fairly ambitious approach that we have in mind. We are very conscious of the timelines. So we see this as an iterative approach. We would love to be able to highlight actions or commitments that are ready at the summit. There will be lots of opportunities to showcase them. But we've also engaged the government of Argentina and Robin Hodes, the incoming co-chairs, and they're quite keen to ensure that there is some ongoing oversight and whatnot, so that this isn't a flash in the pan. This is the priorities do align with their co-chair priorities also. So we would like to very much encourage you to bring some ambition to this. I see that there are a few comments already. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat right now, and I'll start addressing the first two that are already up there. So the first that we have is a question around whether or not actions at the summit could be around revising the current OGP mechanism and engaging with civil society earlier on in the National Action Plan process and not just waiting for the IRM report. I'll speak from a national government perspective and then turn to Jaime for further detail. This is something that we very much agree with within Canada, and it's something that we have already acted on. So individual countries are fully empowered to start doing this work already. We found that with the IRM review coming a year after our plan had been in place, and often the delays in publication, it meant that recommendations were coming later in the process and we weren't actually able to react to them in any sort of meaningful, timely way. So we have quarterly updates that go on our National Open Government website, and we have just started meeting with our civil society forum, our multi-stakeholder forum, to support those quarterly reviews. We did it for the third National Action Plan, the quarterly updates, and this past quarter was the first one where we had the meeting with civil society. So on that, there are certainly opportunities for national governments to try to deepen the feedback loops. At this point, it seems that that's the most appropriate way of addressing the concern, but I'll turn to Jaime for a response on that question.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Moore, for the question. So just before getting into the more detailed response, I just want to reiterate that we do have the mechanisms in place to safeguard both the values but also the process of OGP, of which the IRM mechanism is just one of them. So with that in mind, and reiterating what Jamie has mentioned, yes, the IRM reports that are coming out this year, we'll start addressing these questions and assessing the design of the co-creation processes within countries. And the IRM will be is undergoing a refresh process this year so that it can better address these problems and to better serve its purposes, including on the timing of when the reports come out so that they can be better used by POCs and civil society. So that comment is very much welcome, and we're definitely working on improving not only the IRM mechanism but also the other response mechanisms that we have within the OGP to address these concerns.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll move to the next question in the interest of time. So the next question is, are tech companies going to be part of the discussion on disinformation? So good news, yes. There are going to be two major venues at the summit for the discussion around fake news and disinformation. The first is that on the margins of the summit on the Tuesday, the Canadian House of Commons is collaborating with other parliaments around the world to host a meeting of the Grand Committee on Fake News and Disinformation. They've extended invitations to parliamentarians from, I believe, nine countries. There's some media coverage on this if you're interested in learning more. And they will be looking at convening discussions with the private sector around fake news and disinformation. The second venue at which this is going to be discussed is through the summit sessions. So we are doing something slightly different with this global summit. We will have 4 plenary sessions over the course of the summit, as in addition to the concurrent sessions that have been populated through the competitive call for sessions. So in terms of the plenaries, we've already identified fake news and disinformation as an important topic to be explored on a cross-sector basis. So that's certainly one that we are anticipating will have good buy-in and good participation from the private sector. It's still, just given the profile and, given the head of state participation at this point, it is starting to, we don't have full confirmation, but the names that are looking like they are likely to confirm, I think you'll be quite pleased, and these conversations will indeed be happening on a cross-sector basis. Okay, are there other questions? I see that there's an additional question that popped up. So one around the digital divide. This is a very, I think, important question. It's difficult to talk about impact in the digital era when many of our citizens do not have good internet access and broadband. So I think that it's well worth including that sort of inclusion lens when we talk about impact. I think what we'll do, though, is take note of this consideration, and if there are good commitments that surface, we would be happy to share them with this community. It's something that we're very conscious of, and we've continued to, at least in Canada, we've continued to invest in internet and broadband access. But it's certainly difficult to, point well taken, and I'm not sure that there's an easy fix. Given that we've got about 5 minutes left, I think we can just open up the phone lines if there aren't any other clear questions. So did anybody want to orally pose a question? Okay, I'm just scrolling through the, I'm scrolling through the questions. I think we've addressed most of them. See that there's a request for clarification from Mukulani around responses through the OGP platform and process. Jaime, I think I'll propose that we leave this as an action item for the OGP.
Yes, fully agree, and we're happy to follow up.
Wonderful. Okay, I hope I haven't missed any questions, but I think, oh, there's a comment around definitions. So I take the point around challenging definitions, particularly in the context of the impact priority. Perhaps when we presented this call to action to the members of our expert advisory panel on the summit, one of the members I thought was quite eloquent in trying to frame it around empowering citizens to have greater agency in the use of digital tools. So perhaps that's an easier way of understanding it. If that language resonates more with the community, we're quite happy to adjust that. The letter is, I think, fairly cooked and has been signed at this point, so you won't see it adjusted in the letter itself, but we can certainly update our own vocabulary with that. Jaime or Tonu, Allison, did anybody have anything to add before we wrap things up?
I don't believe so. I think we covered it all from our side.
Wonderful. Okay, and I do see that there is there are questions around Azerbaijan. I'll invite the OGP to follow up with that individual directly. And I also see that there's a question around receiving a link to the PowerPoint presentation. No problem. We'll make sure that that goes out to the community. And we still need to have further discussions about greater clarity around digital rights. And I think part of the concern there is that we need to see what other members of this community are happy to do. We're very happy on behalf of sort of our government to share what's in the works, but this does have to be a collaborative effort. And given that the call to action is just going out now, we don't really have much to show for it quite yet. So I think it's going to be over the next couple of weeks more, we're going to be defining what the response looks like more concretely. Thank you all very much for participating today. We do recognize that this doesn't give a huge amount of time for people and for governments in particular to react to this call to action, but we are hopeful that you will come to Ottawa with a good degree of specific commitments and ambition. It's an important time for open government. We owe it to our governments, to our citizens to do better on open government and make sure that this global movement is sustained. So we are very hopeful that you will continue to work on these important issues. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions, concerns. All of the points of contact should have seen ministerial level invitations to your ministerial lead. We are hopeful that many of you will participate. Please make sure that you go ahead and formally do your registration and book hotels early. Hotels in particular are going to be a challenge here in Ottawa, so book early. And feel free to get in touch right to the generic email address if you do have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you all very much for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the end of May in Ottawa. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.